The night was silent, save for the echo of engines rolling through the narrow waters of the Oslofjord. It was just after 4 a.m., April 9th, 1940, a cold Tuesday morning. From the south, a dark shape moved steadily through the mist. The German heavy cruiser Blücher, pride of the Kriegsmarine, led a column of warships northward, its bow slicing through the black water. On board, more than 2,000 men, sailors, soldiers, and bureaucrats, believed they were about to seize Oslo and secure Norway before dawn. But on the small island of Oscarsborg, hidden in the fjord's narrow throat, an aging Norwegian fortress stood in their path. Its commander, Colonel Birger Eriksen, had been awake since midnight. His orders from Oslo were vague. The government, uncertain of Germany's intentions, had not declared war. But as Eriksen watched the distant glow of searchlights reflecting off the fog, he made his choice. He turned to his men, conscripts most barely trained, and spoke calmly. "Either I will be decorated, or I will be court-martialed. Fire." Moments later, the thunder of 11-inch Krupp guns shattered the night. The shells screamed across the fjord, their trails vanishing into darkness. Then, impact. The Blucher lurched violently as fire erupted from her deck. Within minutes, chaos consumed the German flagship. It was the first clash of the German invasion of Norway, and one of the most improbable victories of the entire war. Ancient guns and forgotten torpedoes, relics from the last century, had just stopped one of Hitler's most modern warships dead in the water. The fjord itself became a graveyard, and the decision made by one aging officer in the fog would change the fate of a nation. Europe was burning. By the spring of 1940, Adolf Hitler's armies stood poised to dominate the continent. Poland had fallen. Denmark would soon surrender without a fight. And now, the Führer's gaze turned north, to Norway, a country of mountains, fjords, and vital sea lanes. To Hitler, Norway was not just another conquest. It was a lifeline. German industry ran on Swedish iron ore that passed through the Norwegian port of Narvik each winter when the Baltic froze. If Britain controlled Norway's coast, Germany's war machine could be strangled in months. The plan was named Operation Weserübung, the Weser exercise. Under it, German forces would simultaneously seize 6 key Norwegian cities: Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. The strategy relied on speed, surprise, and shock. At its core was Task Force 5, commanded by Admiral Oskar Kummetz. His mission: capture Oslo intact, occupy the capital before dawn, and secure the Norwegian king and government before they could flee. The flagship of his fleet was the brand-new heavy cruiser Blücher, sleek, fast, and bristling with guns. But there was a flaw in the plan, one born not of arrogance, but of ignorance. German intelligence had studied old maps and outdated reports that described Norway's coastal fortresses as relics, obsolete and unstaffed. They believed Oslo's defences would crumble at the first show of force. They were wrong. Far from Berlin's planning rooms, the fjords told a different story. The narrow waterways were treacherous, walled by cliffs, threaded with fog, and filled with unseen dangers. And guarding the entrance to the capital like a forgotten giant stood Oscarsborg Fortress, its guns old, but its heart unbroken. On the evening of April 8th, as Blucher and her escorts approached the southern tip of Norway, a small Norwegian patrol vessel, Pole 3, spotted them. Its commander, Captain Leif Welding Olsen, radioed Oslo to report unknown warships entering Norwegian waters. Before he could get a reply, tracer fire split the night. The Pole 3 burned and sank, and Welding Olsen, refusing to abandon his post, became the first Norwegian to die in the invasion of his homeland. By midnight, the Germans pressed on, undeterred. Their fleet steamed into the fjord, past lighthouses dim for blackout, past fishing villages that slept unaware of the armada sliding silently by. Above them, at Oscarsborg, Colonel Eriksen stood on the ramparts listening to the low thunder rolling through the mist. He didn't know what was coming, only that something vast and foreign was moving toward the capital. And as the first glimmer of dawn touched the water, the sound of engines grew louder. The iron road north was open, but ahead lay a fortress, and a decision that would stop an empire in its tracks. Through the night, the German armada cut silently through the fjord, a procession of dark silhouettes gliding past sleeping villages. The lead ship, Blücher, moved confidently, her bow waves shimmering under the moonlight. She was the pride of the Kriegsmarine, barely 6 months in service, her decks gleaming and her crew restless with expectation. Behind her followed a convoy of warships and transports, the light cruiser Emden, the escort ship Lutzow, and smaller vessels packed with infantry, Gestapo officers and political envoys. Among them were bureaucrats destined to form the new Reichskommissariat of Norway once Oslo fell. The men aboard Blucher believed they were heading to a near-bloodless victory. Their orders were clear: seize the capital, arrest King Haakon VII, and secure the government before dawn. Few expected resistance. At Admiral Oscar Kummetz's table, maps lay spread beneath the dull red glow of a lamp. His officers traced the fjord's narrow path northward, whispering quietly over coffee and cigarette smoke. The Admiral was calm, assured. Berlin's intelligence had declared Oslofjord's defences obsolete, its guns rusted, its soldiers few. The mission was to be more a ceremony than a battle, but in the stillness, the fjord hid its secrets. As the flotilla advanced, faint signals flickered along the shore, Norwegian lookouts awakening to the thunder of engines. Messages began to move through the darkness, reports of unidentified ships, too large for fishing vessels, too organized for merchants. Further north, at Oscarsborg Fortress, those messages reached Colonel Birger Eriksen. His men had been on alert since midnight, their searchlights sweeping through the mist, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The fortress had not fired its guns in decades. Many of its soldiers were conscripts barely trained to load them. Down below, buried into the island's rock, an ancient torpedo battery slept in darkness, manned by a skeleton crew of reservists who had never fired a live shot. They oiled mechanisms built before they were born, checking gauges that had not moved in years. Outside, the water was calm. A mist hung low over the channel. The engines drew nearer. At 4 a.m, Blucher entered Drobak Sound, her searchlights cutting through the fog. On her decks, sailors stood ready for the salute they expected from the Norwegian fort ahead. A formality, nothing more. But the fortress remained silent. No lights, no signal. Only the sound of gulls and the slow churn of steel in water. Inside the command post, Colonel Eriksen studied the silhouette emerging through the haze. He asked for identification. None came. He gave one final order. "Ready all guns!" The batteries creaked as they swung toward the approaching ship. In the fog-drenched stillness of the fjord, the war was about to begin. And no one on Blucher knew it yet. At the narrowest point of the Oslofjord stood an island of rock and pine, Oscarsborg Fortress. Built in the 1890s, it had once been Norway's pride, its cannons guarding the approach to Oslo. But by 1940, it was a relic. The guns were older than most of the men assigned to them, and the fortress was staffed not by veterans, but by reservists and raw conscripts. Yet beneath the stone walls, buried deep in the bedrock, something ancient and forgotten still waited. When Colonel Birger Eriksen took command of Oscarsborg, he had inherited not just rusting artillery, but a duty to protect the capital, no matter how outdated his tools. Now, in the pale mist of that April morning, He stood at the heart of a defence no one in Berlin even knew existed. His men were nervous. Some had never fired a live round. The fog was so thick they could barely see the water below. But through the haze came the unmistakable growl of diesel engines, a sound that didn't belong in peaceful Norway. In the gun battery known as Kopos, crewmen loaded 2 massive Krupp 11-inch guns, each shell weighing nearly 300 kilograms. These weapons had been installed in 1893 and hadn't seen action since. Down below, at the torpedo battery, the last functioning underwater weapon system in Norway was being prepared. Its operators, most of them in their 50s, checked the valves and air compressors on torpedoes built before the First World War. Whitehead models, primitive but deadly. The men worked quietly, following rituals remembered from older officers. They didn't know if the weapons would even fire. No one had tried in decades. At 4:15 a.m., spotters at the southern post caught movement through the mist. Dark hulls, a column of ships heading north. The first was enormous. Colonel Eriksen hesitated only a moment. His standing orders required confirmation from the capital before opening fire. But Oslo wasn't answering. He turned to his artillery officer, Captain Andreas Andersen, and gave the command that would become legend. Fire with the main battery. Aim for the leading ship. The crew held their breath. The old fort trembled as the first gun roared. The fortress had come alive. From deep in the tunnels, the torpedo men listened as echoes of the guns rolled through the rock. They readied their levers. Above them, Eriksen watched as a fireball briefly lit the mist. The German cruiser Blücher had been struck. He ordered a second round. Another explosion tore across the fjord. The fortress in the fog, dismissed as obsolete, had just awakened and changed the course of the war in Norway. The first shell struck Blucher near her forward superstructure, tearing through her side and igniting stores of fuel and ammunition. Men on deck were hurled into the air as burning oil splashed across the steel. The ship shuddered violently, slowing as smoke billowed from her midsection. Inside the bridge, alarms screamed. Admiral Oskar Kummitz, stunned by the sudden attack, ordered full speed ahead and demanded identification of the attacker. But there was no time. The fog had swallowed the shore, and the flashes of gunfire were the only answer. A second 11-inch shell hit moments later. It smashed into the aircraft hangar, detonating fuel for Blücher's reconnaissance plane. Flames raced across the decks. Ammunition stores began to cook off. The cruiser's internal lighting failed. Men stumbled through corridors lit only by the orange glare of fire. On the hill above, Colonel Birger Eriksen gave his next order calmly. Prepare the torpedo battery. In the darkness below the fortress, the old crewmen opened the steel doors of their launch tunnels. Cold seawater rushed in. They set the depth to 3 meters, just below Blücher's armoured belt, and waited. At 4:34 a.m. the command was given. Fire torpedo 1. A low hiss, then silence, followed by a dull explosion as the weapon hit home. Seconds later, fire torpedo 2. The second torpedo struck amidships. The blasts tore open Blücher's port side, flooding engine rooms and knocking out her steering. Power flickered, then died. She began to list heavily. Above decks, chaos reigned. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Ammunition magazines exploded one by one. Smoke and steam enveloped the bridge. Men leapt into the freezing fjord, their uniforms aflame. The oil slicks burning on the surface turned the water itself into fire. In the command tower, Admiral Kummitz realized the truth. His flagship was lost. He signaled the ships behind to halt and reverse course. But the narrow fjord made maneuvering impossible. The entire invasion column jammed together, trapped in confusion. By 5 a.m., Blücher was drifting, her bow sinking. The proud cruiser, Hitler's spearhead to capture Oslo, had been gutted by guns and torpedoes built before the First World War. From the fortress, Eriksen watched the burning ship through breaks in the fog. He could hear faint explosions echoing across the water. Then, at 7:30, a massive detonation split the air as the cruiser's magazine exploded. The blast rolled down the fjord like thunder, shattering windows miles away. When the smoke cleared, Blucher was gone. She had taken with her more than 800 men, sailors, soldiers and officials meant to govern Norway under German rule. The survivors clung to debris or swam toward shore, only to face the icy grip of the fjord. For the Norwegians, the unimaginable had happened. An obsolete fortress manned by conscripts and reservists had destroyed one of Germany's newest and most powerful warships, and in doing so, they had bought something beyond measure: time. Because of Blücher's destruction, the German invasion schedule collapsed. Troops meant to seize Oslo were stranded. The royal family and government, alerted by the explosions, began their flight north. As the flames faded on the fjord, the echoes of that morning would soon reach every capital in Europe, and Hitler's perfect plan had just unravelled because one Norwegian officer refused to wait for orders. As the fires of Blücher burned through the morning, their glow was visible for miles down the fjord. The thunder of the explosions rolled north toward Oslo, a distant warning carried on cold air. In the capital, telephones rang, radios crackled, and the truth dawned. Germany had invaded Norway. At the royal palace, King Haakon VII and his ministers gathered in haste. They had expected negotiations, not bombs. Only hours earlier, the German envoy in Oslo had delivered a message promising friendship. Now the sound of battle echoed from the sea. The king was 70 years old, dignified but resolute. When his advisers urged surrender, he refused. "Norway cannot yield to force," he said quietly. "We will not hand our country to Hitler." Thanks to Blücher's destruction, the German troops meant to seize the palace and arrest the government were stranded. The invasion schedule was in ruins. Admiral Oscar Kummetz's surviving ships dared not advance through Drobak Sound again, fearing the same invisible guns and torpedoes. For a few precious hours, Norway had a chance. The government ordered an evacuation. Trains were prepared, documents packed, royal regalia sealed into crates. The most valuable cargo of all, the Norwegian crown and the king himself, departed the city just after noon. As they left Oslo, German aircraft appeared overhead, circling like vultures. Bombs fell on the outskirts of the city, but the royal convoy pressed northward along snow-covered roads. Each hour gained was bought with blood and fire at Oscarsborg. Behind them, German forces finally landed at Moss, south of Oslo, and began their advance toward the capital. But they were too late. By the time they entered the city that evening, the king and government were gone, carrying Norway's sovereignty with them. For the Norwegians who remained, the sight of Blücher's burning wreck drifting beneath the cliffs became a symbol, proof that the invaders could bleed. For Hitler, it was an embarrassment. His lightning conquest of Norway, planned to be swift and bloodless, had been slowed by one fortress and one man who refused to wait for orders. Colonel Birger Eriksen and his garrison stood ready for the next assault. They expected annihilation. Instead, they received radio silence. The Germans hesitated, unsure how many more guns or torpedoes waited in the mist. By the time they finally reached Oscarsborg and took the surrender of its exhausted defenders, the king was gone, the government in exile, and Norway's resistance alive. That single act of defiance in the early morning hours of April 9th had bought the kingdom its freedom in spirit, if not in territory. And in a war ruled by technology, blitzkrieg and terror, it was an ancient fortress, and the courage of a handful of men that had rewritten the first chapter of Norway's fight for survival. The wreck of the Blücher still lies beneath the cold waters of Drobak Sound, silent, rusting, and shrouded in silt. For decades its twisted steel has rested where it fell, a monument to the morning when an empire met its match. In the days following the sinking, word spread quickly across occupied Europe. The Germans had seized Norway, but not without humiliation. Blücher's loss delayed the capture of Oslo and allowed Norway's leadership to escape, ensuring that the Norwegian flag would fly again in exile, beside those of Britain and the Free French. In Berlin, Hitler was furious. His admirals blamed outdated charts and fog. His intelligence officers blamed the weather. But deep down, everyone understood what had happened. Germany's most modern warship had been destroyed by 19th-century guns and torpedoes built before the First World War. Weapons the invaders had dismissed as scrap. At Oscarsborg Fortress, the defenders waited for the inevitable counterattack. When the German troops finally arrived, they found the garrison exhausted but unbroken. Colonel Birger Eriksen surrendered only after confirming that his men had accomplished their duty. Even the German officers who accepted his surrender reportedly saluted him, a gesture of respect for a man who had defied impossible odds. For Norway, Eriksen became a national hero. His calm defiance, his decision to act without orders, embodied the spirit of resistance that would carry the country through 5 long years of occupation. In the decades that followed, the story of the Blücher and Oscarsborg was told and retold, not just as a tale of battle, but as a reminder of resolve. The wreck remained on the fjord's floor, leaking oil, occasionally disturbed by divers or salvage teams. Eventually it was declared a protected war grave. Each year on April 9th, Norwegians paused to remember the day their fortress woke from its long sleep and brought their nation its dignity. Standing on the ramparts today, it's easy to imagine that morning, the faint hum of engines, the silence before the first thunder of the guns. The fjord looks peaceful now, calm, reflective, serene. But beneath its surface lies the memory of fire and steel, of courage and fear, of decisions made in seconds that changed a nation's fate. History often celebrates the weapons of power, the great machines, the endless arsenals. But sometimes history turns not on power but on resolve, on a handful of men, an old fortress, and the conviction that surrender is not the only choice. That morning in 1940, the echoes of the fjord carried across Norway and into history, a reminder that even in the age of modern war, the heart of resistance still beats in the courage of ordinary men.